Good morning, my name is Jackie Anderson and I'm an assistant dean at the University of St. Thomas. I'd like to welcome you to our second session of our Spring 2021 online learning series. Thank you for joining us today. Today's session is Managing the Tension Between Waterfall, Scrum, and SAFe Project Management with University of St. Thomas Management Professor Ernest Owens. Now, Ernie is a highly regarded teacher that is gifted in creating clarity around topics that seem at odds. And actually, that's the charter for today's session. But before I introduce Ernie, I want to take a minute and give you a chance to mark your calendar for some of our upcoming sessions. On Thursday, April 8th, we have Professor Lynn Olson, who will lead a session titled Systems Thinking, a Leadership Game Changer. The session will focus on your organization as a system and how you can see larger patterns to influence processes and decision-making. And then, ironically, we wrap up our spring series on Thursday, May 6th, with the incomparable Allison Smith, who teaches in our Executive MBA and our St. Thomas Executive Program here in Executive Education. The title of her session is Joy at Work, and I have a feeling that will be reviewed in the literal and the figurative sense of that statement. It'll be an uplifting close to our spring online learning series. Actually, I think spring is just going to be an uplifting time in general. I hope you consider joining us for the rest of the series, but let's get on to today's main event. In a moment, I'm going to hand over the virtual platform to Ernest Owens. Now, please feel free to use the chat feature to send me any and all questions. As usual, we're going to hold the questions for the end and reserve some time to answer them. Our goal will be to end between 8:50 and 8:55, so you can grab a cup of coffee before you go on to your next meeting. And remember, if you have any technical difficulties, we're recording the whole session and it will be emailed to you in the next few business days. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ernest Owens. Ernie is a University of St. Thomas Management Professor in the Opus College of Business. Now, Ernie has led the development of pivotal business curriculum, including building out our very popular Certified Professional Project Management Certification, or CPPM. So if you enjoy today's session, our next full course for CPPM is kicking off on April 7th. Now, Ernie is the 2020 Diversity and Inclusion Award winner here at the University of St. Thomas, and also a recipient of the Distinguished Service Award in the Opus College of Business. And just recently, he was named a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Fellow. And prior to his time in academia, Ernie had a distinguished career in industry, holding executive roles at Unisys, IBM, Mass General. Ernie is always an engaging speaker. I know you're going to have a great session. It is my pleasure to welcome my colleague and my friend, Dr. Ernest Owens.
Thank you, Jackie. I'm going to share my screen here, make sure we have the actual screen up. Do I have the right one in front of everybody here, which says Comparative Sessions in Waterfall? Just to make sure that's correct. Thank you. This is a piece of work that I've been working on, and it's not to be taken as a final narrative, but an exploration of the question between my executive, graduate, undergraduate students in project management. I'm continuously being asked a question, what's going on between these different disciplines? And so what I wanted to do was just go through the process and share some of my thinking with you on this. And I think there are some interesting research questions that could come out of this process later on. I always think about the concept, there are three key things that can make any project go off the rails. And the first one is going to be the project definition. The second would be the project manager. And the third is a project process. And so we're looking more at the project process piece here today in this discussion. So let me move. I got to get my mouse on the right screen here so my toys will work right. And so what are the core planning psychologies to keep in mind about a project is that you own the project does not own you. Now, that's important because I think a lot of people who have come to the Agile narrative, who have come to planning, tend to think that planning has in itself an inherent problem, and that it can sort of control what you do. And I think that's the wrong mindset. Planning is a tool that gives you possibilities. It gives you a way of thinking about what's going on and what you can do. And so at any point in time, you're free to change your plan, which is, again, we'll see as a part of the Agile narrative. But the key process here is to understand that you should never assume that because you made a plan that you're fixed. It is fixed. It is focused. It is a dynamic process, and it changes on you continuously, and your mindset towards that's important. This chart gets at the idea that, again, planning is important. Again, if you want to free yourself up and do things, it's better to start out working on what is it you're trying to do and have a sort of an architecture for it, have a sense what you're trying to do, so that there are other things you can do. Most of us as project managers have more than we can do in a given day. But if you're just constantly doing things in a sense of one thing after the other because it makes logical sense without thinking back as to, should I be doing this, or is there a way to optimize on this, you can waste a lot of time. And I do like what Benjamin Franklin said here, by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. And what that is getting at, this question, one would argue, be tacit or profound knowledge versus just doing things and having knowledge in the moment. And so I would encourage you to think about why these two or these different methodologies work for you, and also encourage you to think about your own personality as to why you may want to do this. It has also become clear to me over time is that we tend to have two key different cultures in the project community. The first one I'm going to call punitive, which I think most people are under. And the concept of this is that actions mean success. Doing something is success. And a plan is almost never right. Well, plans are dynamic. Once you make a statement of a plan, you must understand that you can continuously change it. And so the whole idea that actions make success does not mean that just doing something and doing something for the sake of doing it is performance or is successful. And one of the key issues I would love to know, and would be a good research piece I think would be, is what has the idea of dynamic action done in terms of cost, success, and how things have happened in project planning versus plans that were a little bit more thought out, and over time you will get some organizational learning. And that's that second piece down there, the learning culture, the transformational piece. How did you shift yourself from where you are to where you're going? And the word I like is entropy. For those of you remembering your chemistry, that comes from the second law of thermodynamics. And it's the concept that any system that does not have positive energy applied towards it will randomize. And what does that mean? It means if you don't apply positive energy to your system itself will go chaotic. And so it's curious as to how an agile or a waterfall culture manages itself in terms of how it produces its outcome. Is that managed effectively? Because if your system's not working right, you're still going to produce less than optimal solutions. And also you'll have less organizational intelligence coming out of the process. And so again, another issue would be what's going on in the learning of these systems. How has Agile versus Waterfall produced a better organizational intelligence over time? And that, I think, is an interesting tension in itself. Many of you have seen the PMI's Waterfall narrative. And here I'm not going to discuss all the phases, but to talk about the concept of how the phases themselves sort of point out that you're looking at a system. The interaction, the constant undulation, the recursive narrative of a project, in which, again, we have taken to think in terms of Agile is a good thing. But the feedback loops in here are a little bit more dynamic, I think, in terms of the idea of understanding an overall nature. What am I doing as I go through an enterprise or an organization? And here you could have many practitioners working on something and look at those interactions, because a project or waterfall tends to be a little bit more than just a small subset of people. That, again, depends on the size of your projects, and I do appreciate that. But this raises this question of systems thinking. what's going on inside the system of this project. As we look at the Scrum, some people will use the word Agile, which we know is the largest subset, and I have a chart on that here in a second. But it's the idea that this is more mechanical. It is more straightforward. You have your discernment of what you're trying to put into the process, into your epic, into your story, what you're trying to bring into this narrative. How you're going to partition things into your sprints, how you're going to take that and push it into an execution. And then you do your daily Scrum. The thing that I did not see on this diagram is the idea that if things don't happen in that time period or in that given period, they may get thrown back into the sprint backlog or back into the product backlog and have to be recalibrated back into the process. But this is typically marching forward, and it's marching every day towards making sure you have an outcome. So this is, again, as it says, Agile. It's a micro way of looking at things and getting the process done in a shorter period of time or with a quicker response, a lot more action. And there are some issues here that are interesting that I think we'll look at here a little later on, but it's a concept, again, looking at this team here who's doing this. And when you do pure Agile or Scrum, these people are driving the process, not just Scrum Master, not your product owner, but the people doing the work within that process. So the different types of things, because Agile many times is sometimes used interchangeably with Scrum. And we all know that Agile is a lot larger than that. And so the Scrum being that it has a product owner, the Scrum Master, the team working on the activity and working for your minimum viable products. But then you have the other one that's used a lot, the Kanban approach. That's your basic, what do you have to do today? What's your progress? What do you complete in that process? Then your extreme project management, program management here is working on teams of people working on something intensely together. And it's about the human interaction, it's about the engagement, it's about the production. It's not so much on the schedule, it's about how we work together as stakeholders to get something done in the process. And the many variants here that we have here, but most of these, again, are all focused on the idea of getting it done as quickly as possible. And it's not about so much the checkpoints in the process of say, what is this overall process working right versus this thing we do today, this moment, is it working? And what do we need to tweak it to make it happen? So it's a lot more, in my mind, mechanical than it would be the waterfall. It's a lot more operational in its construct. So we look again at the Agile key concepts or principles. Achieve rapid response. Again, quickness is here. It's the idea of getting this thing done as fast as you can because the environment's changing. And so we're looking at the modification of the environment, having a frequency, maybe a high frequency of modifications, and doing things on a daily basis. Okay, we know our daily scrums. And the teams are trusted to accomplish project goals. And the ownership of this process is given within the team because there's a lot more capability, I think, needs to be in an agile team, a successful agile team, than necessary in the waterfall, because they have to take on a lot of the sort of systems, cultural, process things to make this activity happen. So we're looking for probably a higher skill level person in the process. Face to face in itself, it again, of course, with our wonderful world today of COVID, that is somewhat problematic, and we may have modified that somewhat with the idea that we have these tools today we're using. But it's the idea that you're interacting directly with people, and you're in a somewhat a small team and a small community working to drive the outcome of this particular process. A final work product, and kind of making sure that you have a sense what you're trying to work on, but it's dynamic, a constant and ongoing pace, and a constant ongoing change, and being okay with accepting that the requirements are very fluid. And simplicity in its essential narrative, and then other steps that you're trying to do, your daily stand-up, what you're trying to have in the conversation, getting people to mitigate things, take things out, and make sure the team can do what it's doing. And again, core, a self-organizing team. And it sounds wonderful, but I think there's a lot more in that self-organizing team that we sometimes misunderstand or don't appreciate the fullness of what that means to make the agile process work. And again, the idea that the retrospective is to improve efficiencies. My sense of this, again, is on the retrospective, and it'll be interesting to hear some of the questions or comments on this. My experience with people who have been practitioners is that we don't tend to have as good a response on the retrospectives as we should, because of moving. Agile is about getting things done. So we're moving through the process and getting things done as quickly as possible. And so by its very nature, it's quick, it's self-organized, there's a lot of power and authority given to this team to get things done in that narrative, which would be somewhat different in a waterfall where the teams are broken up by their functional narratives, and there's a lot more conversation, a lot more collaboration across platforms, across organizations, where again, the Agile team is a very tightly knit group of people who work together in a very efficient way if it's done right. Well, some of the things that come to mind as I think about this difference between the different key styles here. We have this product owner. And in many cases, if we go back to the model of the Agile or the Scrum process, this is your key point where the definition of the project is defined between the client, the product owner, and people involved in this process. And I was kind of, by the encouragement of one of my colleagues who's working on a particular project right now, was go out and look at this concept of the certification for product owners. And it's not a lot of in-depth. There are some different courses you can take, but again, not a lot of them are requiring a lot of experience. And so people can become product owners quickly without the insight of what's going on. And why I find that interesting is, I said earlier, the system needs to have somebody who understands the system on a tacit level. So this could be one of your major first fail points in the process. Do we have somebody who understands what they're doing in terms of making that backlog, what they're doing in terms of prioritizing the activities that come to the process? Do they know the nature of the business? And here, the business needs to be thought about more than just I'm producing a piece of software or I'm doing something in a sub-assembly in operations. It's all the environment around that that might matter, the cultures, the styles, the different ways things have been done, the informal systems within the operation. Those come into play. And again, this would be another interesting question, is what is that narrative of the product owner and how has that been defined? The Scrum Master, again, typically is your coach and servant leader, the person who's working with the team to make sure that the project is moving forward. They're protecting the project design, making sure things happen. And they're removing the roadblocks and doing things, but they're not doing the work per se. That's the job of the team. And so the person in the Scrum Master is not an official project manager per se. They're more a person who is going to help this process get through the system and get through the system as quickly and efficiently as possible by removing some of those issues or giving resources and tools to people and sort of helping the team itself feel confident what they're achieving and doing. Here again, the team itself is core to making that Agile project work. They're the core players in defining what comes into that daily Scrum, what comes into that particular process to produce those outcomes. And so you see a real interesting delineation of roles in this process. Whereas when you look at the project manager narrative, there's these capabilities and probably a little bit more. And what I mean by that is the project manager has to understand the strategic rationale for why this project is happening. And so if you deal with the idea of, particularly with PMI, PMBOK, when you look at version 4 to 5, they made a connection between the idea of strategic planning and project management. And the strategic planning process creates strategies, purpose, what we're trying to do, how we're trying to do it, what's it for, and you're creating these strategies. Well, all those strategies become programs and projects. And understanding the strategic rationale for why these projects and what they're doing and what their impacts on the enterprise are. And so the project manager is a little bit more of a political practitioner. They've got to understand that this project or program is going across many different functions and organizations and probably many different players. And so what is that political sphere like? What's that environment about? And who are the stakeholders? we have the stakeholder discussion being in the Agile world, pretty much in the realms of the product owner and the management team. But the project manager has to understand these stakeholders, because these stakeholders' needs and wants can be quite different and quite interesting in the formal sense and the informal sense. And the project manager is a surrogate for a sponsor. And so the product owner is reporting and working with the senior leadership and the client. The project management way is working for a specific sponsor in the enterprise, possibly a team of people, could be just the program manager, could be somebody in the senior leadership. And so the understanding of their job is to make this project happen effectively for that organization. And they're the schedule owner. They get judged by the schedule, and it becomes a major issue. Whereas in the Agile narrative, when we talk about the story points and things of that nature, we come up with a process, getting things done within the sprints. Yes, there's a scheduling piece here, and the schedule is owned by the team, not the Scrum Master. But the whole idea is that the schedule is something that's managed differently by days and units of time. I'll talk more about this a little later on in the project management place. And they are more of a risk assessor, looking at all the implied risks, not just within the project, but within the ethos that the project resides in. And things can go quite wrong quite fast if you don't pay attention to risk. And one of the ones that I'm interested in, again, because of my diversity, equity, and inclusion background, is do we understand those kinds of risks when we put together these teams? We go into different environments and how that activity works. And so we have a different view of these projects. If you look at the sort of Scrum Agile narrative versus the idea of the typical project management world. One is, again, more of a systemic world view, and the other is more of getting this particular set of features, these component parts out that come out to be a minimal viable activity, and hopefully executing a number of those different pieces as we go through the process. And so, excuse me, when I look at the concept of waterfall versus Scrum in terms of the idea of scheduling, in the waterfall, we say it's defined. And again, we all know that change says, yeah, it's defined, and particularly it's defined if you have what's called a schedule constrained project. But it's not defined if you've got a resource constrained project. If you're resource constrained, you cannot hold an end date. So we'll typically talk about waterfalls defined, but that would be something that says it must happen at this point in time. And so if you're going to go to Mars, you've got a certain window of time, you've got to be there. There's just no other way around it. Scrum, the schedule is defined by the story points and put into these different sprints, and it's pulled together with the product owner and the Scrum Master and the teams, and we're coming up with what should be the time this is done. But we know that in Agile, that date is developing, is dynamically moving based on what we're trying to achieve and how we're making these activities happen. So it's a little bit less defined in the process. Waterfall, a lot more clarity and certainty. If you're building a house, you simply want to know what the house looks like. Where Scrum, certainty is ambiguous. Again, if you're doing a piece of software, you have a strong sense of what you're trying to do, but you do know that you may have some releases that have, or some features, you have some things that need to be defined as you're going through the process. Outcomes, producing what is defined pretty much in the waterfall. We're saying we're going to do this thing and we're going to produce it and we're going to work towards it. Again, in Scrum, we say we have a sense of what we want to do, but we're going to be redefining that dynamically as we're going through the process. And so the environment for Waterfall, a bit more structured, bit more defined roles and capabilities. And in Scrum Organic, it's changing. As we meet different requirements and different things that pop up, we may have to redefine what we're trying to do here, what resources we need in that process at a very higher pace or a higher frequency. Organizational IQ. And to me, when you do these projects, and one of the things that I would love to also see in the study and the literature is, do we understand that projects are an investment for the organization? If they are an investment organization, what have been the returns for this type of style of project management? And so in typical waterfall, you have your lessons learned, and you have a lot more definition about what the organization can do next based on having done this project. Scrum, it depends on the organizational culture. If you got a very strong culture that does retrospective very well, you can have a good, clear IQ coming out of that process. But in many cases, I hear from a lot of practitioners, this is weak. This is not done very well. We don't tend to take the IQ back from these different agile activities and to define how we might modify the enterprise itself. Documentation, detailed under the waterfall, a lot more documentation. This is where some people find that this is problematic, maybe too much documentation. Whereas in Scrum, somewhat scattered. It is always interesting to watch somebody try to do the same similar type project a year later and looking at the documentation and may not be as good as you have or not a good foundation for a like analysis. Certification. Those of you who got the PMP or got the certification that we offer here as a CPPM, you know that this we look for having had hands-on work for a period of time. And so the Agile, the Scrum certifications, most of them will make a real clear statement. You don't need experience. You can come get that certification. And that's interesting because that raises a different dynamic as to who's playing or who's participating in the process. And to me, that's going to become the issue again of the tacit knowledge of understanding the system and the organization, what you're trying to do. And so I think with that process on the I side of the Scrum side, it requires a lot more capability on the players because they need to be seasoned. And so the experience level on a waterfall, you can take new hires to experience people into this process. On the Agile side, you need people who understand the culture, the way things are done, the business, have the political capability and a moxie to be able to challenge systems and feel comfortable doing that. And so you have a different experience coming to the game when you're talking about this process of waterfall versus Scrum. So the question is always out there, which is better? And again, this is not going to solve world peace here, but we tend to have more static projects, they say, in terms of the waterfall. Many changes throughout the process. Again, in contrast, Agile tends to be a better option for smaller projects when changes like to be made during the design. And then keep in mind that these are just rough guidelines and suggestions. And again, it's also clear that Agile is more flexible and Waterfall's more rigid. And here, when I read that, I find that a problematic statement. That this tells me that somebody believes that you can't make changes dynamically in a waterfall process. And I strongly disagree with that. Even through my experience and through what I've seen happening, I think you can make more changes in waterfall. You don't make a daily Scrum, and that I agree with. And so, but this idea that waterfall is rigid is somewhat more of a mindset that says that I can't get players together or get people together and do things, make dynamic changes at a higher frequency in a waterfall. Each methodology has its pros and cons, of course, and what some are suited for different types. Agile is just that. It's about agility. It's about the perception of speed. And I use the word perception of speed here purposely because it is that ready, fire, aim syndrome that I think sometimes can show itself up here. And so in a waterfall, you're trying to get more of a ready, aim, fire narrative, which raises the question, which one is going to be more cost effective? And so both methodologies can produce a very, very good outcome. The question is, which one is better for the enterprise or better for your culture, better for what you're trying to do? And I think that takes some work. I think that takes some understanding of which process is going to work better for what you're trying to do. The assumption that Agile is better is a mistake, but the assumption that Waterfall is better is also a mistake. The question I ask is, why are you doing and using that methodology in this particular scenario on this particular project? And what do you want the outcome to be? Now, it'll be interesting to see as time goes forward and we get more research and literature on this ability to be agile. And what does it cost us to make these continuously incremental mistakes? Because fail fast, you've got to make these changes. Versus waterfall, what does it cost us to take time to assess those risks and then create an issue with the idea of what does that mean to us in terms of taking out some of the risks, taking out some of the things that might have been caught before we got there in the process. And so I haven't seen a clear literature on this yet. I'm certain that that's out there somewhere, but it raises the question, just because you're fast or just because you're quote unquote more rigid, is that good or bad? Well, I think if you're sending me, as Elon Musk wants to send a lot of us on a free trip to Mars, I want somebody to have planned that out very, very well. And so doing something in an agile narrative does not make sense. But again, it's very clear in an IT environment that agile works well because the end process is dynamic. It is changing because of the competitive nature of the market, competitive features, the different players you're playing with. As you keep exploring things, your requirement keeps adapting in front of you. And so we can argue that those conditions are met by the different types of projects you're working on as you go through this process. But it might be helpful to understand why both methodologies have fail points. And in my mind, again, it's not that one is better than the other, it's to understand what it's doing, but understand they both can give you particular problems. Waterfall, poor sponsorship. If you have a poor leadership team, and one of the things in Waterfall you'll ask on the requirements is, do you have the right management team for this? Do you have people who are willing to do and lead this effort effectively? Do you have clear requirements? Have you stopped to think about what you're trying to do in this process? And the idea of scope changes. And the idea that you have a scope, know that it is going to modify. It's never going to be the scope you end with. But did you end up with that scope change through scope creep or through scope change control? And our project started for the right reasons. Are you doing things in a very effective way? And so there are a lot of projects out here that you can look at, and you can see how firms have started a project and gotten into the process. Excuse me, I know my eyes are watering here, little algae here. And so the whole idea again is, what is causing this particular process to go off the rails? Well, in Agile, remember we talked about the concept of the Agile process is pretty much driven by the Agile team. And so we have an unreliable team and not a poorly structured team. Agile projects are going to have a difficult time. And so this is where you start off when you're burned right, and you're thinking you're going to come down and get this thing done in a certain amount of time, and you realize the team is just not producing because they're not made right. And then the idea of leadership. Well, the leadership's within the team. Of course, the Scrum Master is there to give guidance and move things forward and get the team on track and help them move forward. But do they have clear leadership and who's doing what? Here, this is interesting because you can see a huge amount of potential problems with the makeup of the team, and particularly the team dynamics can become problematic here for the Agile outcome. Again, are you focused on success and not enough learning? What are you trying to do as you make these activities? So you make this great feature, but then did you learn from what you did in the process? Did you capture the information? Again, what are the metrics that you're trying to work towards? Agility metric is get it done. Let's get this thing through the process. Let's make the features happen. Let's make the modifications dynamically. And the concept of scope creep can also happen at this level because you're continuously going forward. Not relying on experts to learn and implement agile techniques. And so again, how do you get this agility across large organizations? Now, I've worked in large firms where a project team, typically in moderate to large firms, a project team can be 15, 20, maybe more people. Your agile team is 7, 8, 9, 10 people. And so what happens is you can get a lot more learning in a larger project because a learning shared between people in the process. And so how do you get that learning? And particularly if the agile team is going from project to project to project, but not a change in players or not a cross-functional narrative in the process. And so you can develop a culture in that team that has a certain mindset, which may or may not be good. Again, they may be outstanding and produce very well. But the methodology is not a panacea. A lack of leadership is central to why projects typically fail. And leadership meaning, do they understand when they turn these teams loose, whether it's waterfall project, do they give them the right guidance? Do they give them the right sense of what they're trying to do? They understand the nature of the purpose of what they're trying to work on. I put down fair to take consideration in culture and DEI because I've noticed over time and listened to my graduate students is that we typically put on these teams, particularly in both methodologies, people who are much like each other. And many times they don't understand the tacit nature of what they're trying to do, where this particular project is driving itself and where it's going to end up at. And so we may miss the idea of the market. We may miss the idea of the players who are going to utilize a product. We may miss the idea of the global narrative or the ableism. You may miss the idea of the people's orientation and the social issues around what this project is going to do, where it's going to play and how it's going to play out. And so what are those issues about diversity? I'm losing my mind here. I'll get it back together here. Sorry about that. Inclusion. And so the whole idea is how we make this process of getting people from different environments into this particular process. All project managers can execute any project successfully is a mistake. Project managers need to be in the process of making sure they understand that they have capabilities within certain limits and need to grow themselves. Just because you've got a certification, just because you do something in project management does not mean you can go across and do something in every particular process. And so do we make sure that the project people have themselves the ability to go across different places, different capabilities? So in a firm, it's likely that you have Agile and Waterfall running simultaneously and people running under two different types. And are we trying to cross-pollinate these different processes with Agile within Waterfall? And does that work? Does it make sense? And do we have people understanding what that particular process is about? And if the budget's within and on time and schedule, have you done and are you been successful? Here the question is quality. What is quality? Meeting the customer's needs and expectations. So having something that's done on time or within budget may produce something that doesn't work or it doesn't have the features or the right insights to what you're trying to achieve. And so it's also possible that you can do a project and not come in budget and not on time and hit the mark beautifully because you've figured out what the people need, you've focused on what the customer needs in the process. And so the idea of budget and time being crucial or being the only way of doing things, or the idea of schedule being crucial. Well, are you producing the outcomes? Are you getting, what's the satisfaction rate of what you're producing? And I think this is another interesting part about the idea of looking at what does Agile or Waterfall do in terms of meeting the expectations, providing the final outcomes within costs or within schedule or within stated objectives. And so there's a tension there that I think that we should know more about as we look at these particular processes. Again, Agile isn't always consistent with responsible management. I typically think here that when we look at Agile, it's tougher to budget for an Agile project than it is for Waterfall. Because in Waterfall, you have a lot more delineation of the work breakdown structure, the resources applied, and the costing. In Agile, you're coming up with your story points, you're coming up with your idea of your user stories and things of that nature, and you come up with ideas how people are trying to work on things, but it's more of an art than it is a science. And so you have these larger budgets that you typically trying to manage towards. Now, if you got somebody who's got a very good cost background, has a strong intuition of the organization, they can probably fill in that gap and make that work very well. But it's been my experience in our typical projects that the accountant shop or the controller shop are part of the project team. They're part of the design of the discussion. So you get that cross-pollination. It's not always the case, in many cases, not the case in Agile, where the cost functions are part of the Agile team itself. And so you have less responsibility, and we all know that management really focuses on what's happening with the budget, what's going on with the ROI. And so those become issues that will also become very important in the program side of the house of this discussion. And so what are we doing as we look at this particular process? Scheduling. Well, we have different tools, the network diagramming tools, we have the Kanbans, We have the things that give us a sense of where we are on schedule. So again, in network diagramming or work breakdown, using days, month, hours, weeks, or have you, and things of that nature, using dependencies, using the constraints, you can come up with a pretty good approximation of what this project looks like. But you also have a very good baseline for what to delta. In storyboards and Kanbans and everything, you're talking about what's happening, what's been done, but not so much managing the projections of what those activities are. And so there's some, again, tensions in the different ways of coming up with how you schedule. Your calendar versus story points, those are different ways of looking at things. What's more discern, what's more art, capability, intuition. Software, again, both software packages, many software packages can do both out there, quite frankly. But you do see other tools coming to the market like Jira and Smart Sheets and Mondays and things of that nature for the Scrum side of the house. And what you can get with a rich software tool is the ability to mimic the actual environment. What might be going on inside this? What are those constraints? What are those dependencies? What are those resource requirements? What is a constraining event? What's a must start on type of thing? And again, you're relying on that knowledge to come from the project team on the Agile side. They must understand these constraints. They must have a sense of what these dependencies are, relationships are. You've got your things coming in from the backlog into the sprint backlog into coming into the sprint execution. And that system is hopefully understanding and carrying with it an intuition about what those constraints are. Again, you're depending a lot on the capabilities of the team and its ability to have knowledge what's going on in the process. Costing, again, the idea of project costing using value streams, again, looking at how the dollars flow, how the cost flows, the status reports, the sessions, the daily scrums, again, generality versus intensity, and the control systems, earned value analysis versus a retrospective, and the idea, are you managing your projects effectively in this process? And so learning, interim postmortems, final learning, your retrospectives, and the key thing again is, what are you documenting and are you managing that information as you go through the process? So one of the things that I was doing when I looked at this is we talk about SAFe, and SAFe really, I think it's not just to talk about it as SAFe versus Waterfall, but really SAFe versus program management. SAFe is really the idea of bringing the different things on the concept of different agile activities or different Scrum activities together to have an overall process. And so when you start looking at SAFe, you start pulling together many different things that got to come together, much like in program management. You're bringing what we call sub-projects or many projects together to get this activity done. And so we look at that. You have tools out there that can help you. And so with your SAFe, you have your release train. And in your release train, you have the different agile activities going, your different Scrum activities going, and you're moving those through and you're letting them go at certain rates. Every 2 weeks, you let another element go onto the tracks and start moving in and start managing the activity. Whereas on the Waterfall, the program manager side, you're bringing in these different sub-projects. And again, each of these are individual projects. And you're now stacking those up and putting them on a calendar and managing those sort of activities. So in both cases, this skill set is somebody who's bringing together the aggregate of the Waterfall or the aggregate of the Scrum or Agile process together to manage it over a larger enterprise or a larger system perspective. And so your person who's doing the SAFe activity has got to have a very strong relationship with the people who are the teams and what they're doing in the process, making sure they understand all the stories that are going on this activity. And the Waterfall people are managing all the different sponsors and stakeholders within the different projects and making sure those sort of resource alignments or resource allocations are being done effectively. And so both of these are larger systems of the individual narrative beneath them. Again, what it requires is somebody who understands what Waterfall is or what Agile is and how it works. Who are the customers? What are they looking for? What are the key activities in the process? What are the cost structures and the value stream? Again, both of these are going to focus on having dollarizations. And so it's more the discussion of the aggregate. So the program manager is looking across, and if you look at this column here, you're seeing somebody who's looking across the enterprise. And they're looking at the different functions and the different activities, the procurement and the design and the HR and the costing and the risk assessment, things of that nature across an enterprise look, and looking for deliverables and return on investment. In program management, that's where the buck stops. It's at the desk of the program manager. How's a firm doing? How's it achieving its desired outcome? And so the SAFe flow, the recognizing communications and the tools, and then looking about the Agile release team and looking at making things happen across the enterprise and looking at the value stream and making sure that we're dealing with sustained and operational efficiencies throughout the enterprise around making these Agile projects or these lean activities execute effectively. The interesting piece for me would be in the literature as to how is this more into the management design, how is this more about the strategic narrative and what's coming about in the sort of the SAFe flow process, versus I know over here, this is really driven into the strategic narrative, the strategic planning process of the enterprise. And so this is again about agility, getting things done, making sure things are happening in these 2-week trains, and making sure things are departing and being executed effectively within this sort of block of time, and managing that, versus over here constraining based on specific activities, specific resources, specific pretensions and allocation of resources. And so again, a different sort of mindset as to how you manage that project. We're going to argue that in SAFe, a lack of interest in management. And this is interesting to me when I started doing the literature to find out this is one of the things that popped up as one of the top issues. And I think what this boils down to is that we look at Agile, we look at the multitude of Agile projects, they're typically smaller in size. There's so many of them, it's hard to sometimes understand what the entire thing's about. And so at a SAFe level, somebody here should be, and I'm assuming they are, bringing us to the level of discussion of management to look at the overall narrative. Cost-cutting approaches and managing costs is not one of the dominant things that happen in an Agile narrative. It's more about getting the job done, and cost is a sort of a secondary, tertiary discussion. It is not a primary one, where it would maybe be a primary discussion in a waterfall, the scheduling activities, the lack of communications. Over here on the program side, underestimating program complexity. And this is why agility it seems to have a much favor, because you have brought things down to a smaller piece where the complexity and the simplicity is a little bit easier to digest and understand. In a program or a particular large waterfall project, there is complexity. And so you need somebody who understands that larger narrative, what's going on in the process. We do also have, again, the issue of leadership commitment, but it's not the top thing here in this particular process. And so we, in both cases, need to make sure we understand we got the right leadership throughout this particular process. So what I've given you is a discussion of some potential issues and some potential tensions within the two different disciplines. And I did not promise an answer. That was one thing I want to make sure. But it is raising the question in my mind, and I think it would be a good piece for somebody to research as to why we feel one of these is better than the other, but yet the empirical data is not there. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Jackie Anderson.
Hey, Ernie, that was fabulous. Thank you for those mental models. And as you can imagine, we've gotten a plethora of questions. So I'm going to try to get through as many as I can in the next 5 minutes. So the first one's just a quick clarifying question. Entropy and the value for OI. What does OI stand for?
Organizational intelligence.
Thank you. The next, I've got a series of questions. I'm just going to kind of put them all together and read a couple of them here. The whole product, like new vehicle development, is done through a waterfall process. The software part is done through Agile. How do Agile and Waterfall work together in order to build a successful product in the end? And there are other questions that are, is there a mashup version? Could you say more about running both models simultaneously?
And this is the question that you see. And so let's be frank. And those of you who've done Agile know what I'm about to say. We talk about Agile as if it's pure, but that's not what happens. In most firms, Agile gets sort of modified. You're not supposed to mess with the Agile team when they're doing the development, doing the work, because you have these sprints from defined, but managers always sticking their finger in there and dipping in and going, hey, we need to get things done sooner and doing stuff. And so we have people modifying. And so we have people trying to modify different things. And so just a sort of a simplistic version. I have my students working on a waterfall project semester, but I have them do the stand up each week with their sponsor to talk about how is the project going, what do we need to do now. So we modify it somewhat. You can do some meshing up of the activities, but it requires somebody to understand the system and what you're meshing and to be consistent and to make clear to people how you're doing things. And so if you got the car being done by Waterfall and the software done by Agile, that Scrum Master and that project manager need to be talking. And the Scrum Master needs to understand that they've got something that needs to be done within a period of time. And they can't just say, well, we are working on this feature, we'll get it done. No, they have to meet that specific customer, the project manager's schedule. And if they don't, then you have to talk about the risk discussion. This is where the project manager is going to ask the Scrum Master, what risks are now implied based on using this agility process that we don't have a specific clear end date for these activities. And so that is a dynamic discussion between project and Scrum Masters on this, making sure that process works. I'm not sure if that answered your question fully, but that's what I would think.
Well, and there's another question that's linked to it as well. We're trying to move from Waterfall to Agile, but the team is so used to Waterfall. Any tips for changing the mentality?
Again, the idea is to get them trained, get them into the process, and then sit down and have a discussion about the variance as to why you're going from Waterfall to Agile, why you perceive it's a better thing to do, what's in it for them, and so that they have a desire to want to make this transformation. And what we haven't put on the table here is the concept of rewards. What do people get by doing things a certain way? If the old system rewards them and they feel safer or feel better, rewarded, recognized, they're going to stay with that old system. And so if you're going to move them over to a new system, you're going to find a way to reward them and let them know that the system is going to be better for them, the enterprise, and what you're trying to do. So just saying we're going from one system to the other, people have mastered something, they're known for something, and you're not breaking that cycle of what their rewards are. And rewards aren't always dollars. Let's keep that in mind. Rewards can be the idea of feeling that the enterprise or the people feel good about them and they have a name or a brand. And now you're changing that. Well, how are they going to make that transition?
Thank you. I'm going to try to sneak in two more. In some enterprises, the lines seem to be blurred among the roles of product owner, Scrum Master, and project manager. Do you see these roles evolving, or would this overlap cause too much conflict to be effective?
Well, again, this is the difficulty we got right now because we have clear definitions what Agile is. We have clear definition what Waterfall is. And so now people are trying to blur these lines because they're seeing as they're doing this, that there's a relationship between doing an Agile project and a Waterfall. That example we had a minute ago with the idea being the car and the software running on two different tracks. And we got a product owner, we got a Scrum Master, we got a project manager in here. And in many cases, the project manager is somebody who's dealing with a higher level system understanding what's going on than a Scrum Master. And then the product owner is somebody who's not involved in making the day-to-day happen. They're dealing with the Scrum team and making sure that these activities happen. And so blurring those lines and creating your own system, you can do it. There's no reason why you can't, but you need to make sure when you do it, you document it and you put together a system and a way for people to communicate and be able to have an articulation back and forth amongst them, so that you can explain why you went from Agile in this particular narrative and Waterfall in this narrative and why it works, makes sense in this process. So what's your documentation, what's your training, how you get people to stay on top of this? But again, just doing it and mixing it up, project to project to project, then become problematic. I'm not sure if I answered your question very well.
No, it's great. Then here's the last question. They're tied together. Should a PM specialize in one type of methodology or should they be versed in both? Do you touch on all of these methodologies in your CPPM course?
We do touch on all of them in our CPPM course, and two, the answer is you need to be good at both. You're going to find yourself as a project manager, in many cases, sometimes you can actually find yourself on an Agile team. It is not uncommon for somebody in an Agile team to find themselves working on a Waterfall project at some point in the process as well. And so if you're going to go into project management, whether it's Agile, SAFe, program, project management, Waterfall, whatever it's going to be, you need to know the different disciplines because they're all probably operating inside your firm. And again, that example that somebody gave about the car and software, and the idea of, if your TV set has somebody doing coding on the circuit boards, you look at your house, somebody's got to be doing the idea of wiring it up with the electronics. These are all different things, and you can possibly most likely be doing both throughout your time period.
All right, Ernie, thank you so much. And we hope everyone enjoyed today's session. If you're looking for additional professional development, check out our website. And on a personal note, this past November, I wrapped up my doctorate. And so I am going to be pursuing a new opportunity, which means I'm handing over this emceeing role to my amazing colleague, Devin Smith, who you'll meet next time. We started this program 35 months ago. We've had 35 wonderful thought leaders, but it couldn't happen with the amazing team behind the scenes. I want to thank our ringleader, Brian Godfrey, Jordan Lutter, Jerry Stenger, and Devin Smith. And thank you for the privilege to serve you. And I look forward to participating next month as a participant. So mark your calendar for Thursday, April 8th, Professor Lynn Olson, Systems Thinking, a Leadership Game Changer. Thanks for joining us at the University of St. Thomas. Be well.